All right. Hello and welcome to our first session of Analytic Marxism in the Pittsburgh School with Professor Carl Sachs, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Marymount University, the author of Intentionality in the Midst of the Given, and has published several articles and invited book chapters on Sellers, C.I. Lewis, Carnap, Nietzsche, and Adorno. He's currently working on a book about how Sellers use cybernetics and behaviorism to construct a conceptual framework for cognitive science, and is also co-founder and current vice president of the Wilfrid Sellers Society. I'll now read our seminar description. The neo-Hegelianism of Robert Brandom, John McDowell, and others invites the question of how we might reimagine Marx and Marxism in light of analytic neo-Hegelianism. Do these new readings of Hegel as a philosopher of mind and of language make contact with the dimensions of Hegel that Marx appropriated, revised, and criticized? Can we understand capitalism as a distortion in the space of reasons, or ideology as a cognitive-perceptual error? How can we merge the Marxist emphasis on labor with the analytic emphasis on language? We shall explore the possibility that reconciling the analytic emphasis on language and the Marxist emphasis on labor may require taking seriously aspects of Hegel that have not yet been taken up by analytic neo-Hegelianism, such as the concept of life. So with that said, please, Professor Sachs, I'll give you the word.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction. So I shall begin with a number of caveats or warnings. The first of which is that although I am highly competent on the works of Wilfrid Sellers, I would not say expert, but highly competent. That is not the case when it comes to my knowledge of Marx and Marxism. I am quite confident that there are several people in this class whose knowledge of Marx and Marxism far exceeds mine. I would happily encourage all of you to share your knowledge with us, to point out my misunderstandings and my mistakes. What I am hoping to do in this class is highly conjectural. I am pursuing a particular hypothesis, and I invite you all to criticize the hypothesis, right? Although I am the instructor of record, in communist fashion, we are all equal in the space of reasons. Okay, that's the first caveat. The second caveat is that the class, as I have designed it, is going to be somewhat different from what has been advertised. Because what advertised, I realized, was simply far too ambitious for a meeting, a class of 4 sessions. So what I'm going to do is somewhat more modest. What I propose to do is to look at this very idea of analytic Hegelianism as it has arisen within the Frankfurt School. Oh, sorry, that was a slip, my goodness. As it's written within the Pittsburgh School, my goodness. And then also to raise the question here of what a Marxist engagement with that might look like or should look like. And that's sort of one big question. There's also, I think, another question which I'm also would like to pursue, sort of adjacent to that one, which is the question about whether this criticism might involve a return to some moments of Wilfrid Sellers' philosophy that have been overlooked or suppressed in this rise of the Pittsburgh School. So with that, at this point, I would like to put on my share screen so I can share with you a PowerPoint that I have prepared. So here it's just Come on, Sachs. It's been so long since I've taught anything, I've forgotten how this is done. Here we go. Okay. So then the sort of the background context is we have this idea of the Pittsburgh School, right? A term that is being used, widely used for both good and bad reasons, to refer to an approach of doing analytic philosophy, an approach that's widely shared, that's sort of associated with the names Wilfred Sellars, John McDowell, Robert Brandom, as well as their students, both in the United States and elsewhere. And that this approach is widely associated, or widely credited with having led to a kind of revival of Hegel within analytic philosophy. And that right there raises all sorts of very tricky interpretive questions about whether an analytic Hegelianism really makes any sense, what that would look like, what are the advantages and disadvantages of that, whether that approach to Hegel. I think there are probably questions that need to be explored whether this phrase, analytic Hegelianism, is not in some sense a contradiction. I think there's a question there that needs to be examined. But those with that in mind, I think there are all these two questions. First of all, this question is whether this is vulnerable to a materialist, even Marxist criticism. And then also, would that criticism in some sense motivate a return to the suppressed materialist, Marxist question mark elements of Sellars' own philosophy? So these are the two main questions I'd like to explore in our seminar. And so just to give you a sense of what I plan to do here, I have a few slides I prepared, a few notes I prepared. Well, we go until maybe 10 Eastern time, and then we can take a short break. And then when we return, we can have questions, proposals, comments on the floor, and so on. So here's the schedule of topics as I have imagined it. The first day, today, we're going to talk about this idea of modern materialism, a concept that gets introduced in the late 19th century, taken up and developed in tremendous detail. And I'm sort of interested in what this concept involves and how people doing modern materialism thought of their project. Like, what did they think it was modern about it? And what makes it different from both, what makes it materialist and what makes it modern? Our next meeting will be focused on Sellars, on Wilfred Sellars, and his arguments for a kind of naturalized theory of language. And the main theme I want to develop there is that Sellars thinks that a naturalized theory of language, although that's often presented like, well, this is what Sellars was up to, that's his project. And that's certainly true. But I want to explore this idea that Sellars sees that project as his contribution to a much larger project, namely the project of modern materialism. And so I want to explore that line of thought on our second meeting. On the third day, we will turn to Brandom and McDowell. We will try and explore a little bit from some little bits of their writings, how they understand themselves to be Hegelian. And we will also explore this very interesting article recently done by, I believe, Justin Evans on a kind of Marxist response to their version of Hegel, a way of reimagining Marx based on this Pittsburgh Hegelianism. On the fourth day, I would like to shift gears somewhat and turn to this very interesting Marxist philosopher, Alfred Sohn-Rethel, who has a very fascinating, I think, Marxist critique of epistemology. And it is a critique that I conjecture can very much help illuminate and support ideas that Sellars explores very casually and at a very high level of generality. And in particular, I am interested in the suggestion that Sun Rathel's critique of epistemology can be read, should be read perhaps, as explaining the origins of what Sellars calls the myth of the given. Okay, I now want to share with you some text. Text that I'd asked people to look at for today, but I've been teaching long enough to know that nobody does the reading. Well, maybe you guys are different. At my school, they never do the reading. So the first text I want to share with you is this little bit from Engels's very famous polemic Anti-Dühring from 1878. Itself a sort of remarkable text in the history of Marxism, right? Because, as some of you probably know this, right? Engels sort of takes it, Engels takes it upon himself to seize upon the works of Eugen Dühring, who is, really a quite famous, but, well known at the time, but really just very mediocre thinker. And Engels sort of seizes upon this as an opportunity to systematically present his entire worldview in the framework of a polemic against this one person. It's really quite extraordinary. It's like, what if I were to present my everything I believe in a systematic way in a book just titled Anti-Peterson? Like, it would be perplexing to historians of the future, I imagine. Here's the paragraph from Engels that I want to share. He writes, the perception of the fundamental contradictions in German idealism led necessarily back to materialism, right? And that right there is a very interesting move, right? To say that once people became aware, so first of all, they'll claim that there are contradictions in German idealism. That itself is a hugely controversial claim and a fascinating one. To claim that idealism itself has contradictions that itself is not able to resolve, a well-known Marxist claim, but a very fascinating one and a very controversial one, to be sure. And that this, once he became aware, this necessarily led back to materialism, but not the metaphysical, mechanistic materialism of the 18th century, and by which Engels might have in mind people such as Baron de Holbach or Helvetius, not that kind of, it's all just atoms and void, blindly colliding into each other kind of natural materialism, but rather in contrast to the naively revolutionary, simple rejection of all previous history, modern materialism sees in the latter, in history, the process of the evolution of humanity, it being its task, the task of modern materialism, to discover the laws of motion thereof, right? The task of modern materialism is to discover the laws of motion of human history, including, and that makes it a very emphatically historical project, right? That modern materialism the modern materialist understands herself and her project as part of the process that she is also describing. So there's a very nice how to put this, the self-understanding of what the modern materialist is doing is also an understanding of what it is that human history has been all along. Modern materialism, I have a long passage I've cut out from this particular quote. So the quote I've selected begins then with modern materialism embraces the more recent discoveries of natural science, according to which nature also has its history in time. The major historical discoveries that Engels is referring to are, of course, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, but also it's important to notice Darwin building on Charles Lyell's principles of geology, right? So it's not just that, so he's referring here to the very idea that nature as such has history. So, and then this means that modern materialism is essentially dialectic, and this I find a rather striking quote and a very perplexing one from Engels. No longer needs any philosophy standing above the other sciences. It is quite surprising to find Engels, of all people, saying things that make him sound like a logical positivist. And it's worth, maybe we can return in the Q&A today to whether that is who Engels is really a proto-positivist, or is he simply presenting himself that way in this text for rhetorical purposes. So let us take a moment then to think about what modern materialism might involve. One question would be, okay, what makes this materialism? On one level, there is just historical continuity with other positions that call themselves materialist. And Engels and others who call themselves modern materialists are often quick to stress a continuity of their views with the ancient materialism of Epicurus and Lucretius. So we can say, well, materialism is an explanatory priority of scientific methods and an ontological commitment to the observable physical universe, right? So nothing exists that is not somehow part of the observable physical universe. We're going to reject dualism and idealism. And the best way of understanding the physical universe is going to be by way of scientific methods. And that's going to include understanding ourselves as a particular kind of highly evolved complex organism. What makes it then modern is, I think, importantly, this idea that we're going to criticize the nature history distinction, right? We are going to reject this idea that nature is some sort of ahistorical background and that history is something that human beings do that sort of takes place on the center stage with nature in the background. Right, we're going to reject that kind of nature history distinction. Instead, we are going to say, on the one hand, that nature itself has a history and that human history is part of that history, as well as say that human history is the history of a particular kind of natural organism. And while these might seem truisms or obvious truths today, they were certainly not obvious in the 19th century. Engels is writing this 1878, and for historical context, that is, I believe, 19 years after the first edition of Origin of Species. Right, so Engels is, among other things, a very early adopter of Darwinism. And at a time when the scientific community has by no means come to a consensus on Darwin and on Darwinism. Right? Evolutionary theory, even among scientists, remains highly contentious well until the 1950s, when it's finally put on a rigorous scientific foundation with the rise of population genetics. So Engels is adopting Darwinism very early on, and he quickly realizes that we are adopting an evolutionary worldview that encompasses cosmic evolution, biological evolution, and cultural evolution. And secondly, that historical processes are to be understood as dialectics. So what Hegel discovered as the laws of thought and the essentially developmental character of thought are to then be understood as how you think about historical processes are natural processes. I see there's a great deal going on in the chat. Should I stop my share and take a look at what we're talking about?
Sorry, I was just going back to that Engels' point earlier about it not being philosophy and whether we should interpret that as logical positivism. Apologies.
Oh, right. I see. Yeah, I'm going to take a quick look at that. Yeah. Oh, yeah. You were talking about you. Okay. Well, fine. Yeah, I mean, I think there's this interesting question here about, any time a philosopher advances their project by way of a critique of philosophy, right? There's always something very interesting happening there, right? And I think you're quite right to point out Rorty as a very notorious example of someone whose way of doing philosophy is to say that philosophy is a mistake. And there are actually many philosophers, I think, who carry out this kind of very interesting project, right? Wittgenstein is another example. Carnap, certainly. Right, Carnap has a very famous polemic, or not polemic, manifesto on the unity of science. It begins with a sentence: "The Vienna Circle does not practice philosophy." Right, so there's a long history of sort of philosophy by way of rejecting philosophy, and I think it's interesting. I don't even know if I would say that Engels is the first person to carry out that particular gesture. I think probably we could find lots of people in history of philosophy whose way of doing philosophy is by way of rejecting philosophy. What I want to do now, though, is jump forward in time a few generations and sort of move things along and pick up this quote from the text "Philosophy for the Future" from 1949. Now, this is a really remarkable text. It's difficult to find. As you can see, my copy is first edition, has seen some, it's seen some stuff. It's been places. And this is really a remarkable text in many ways, very much an artifact of a particular moment in the history of American philosophy. The historian George Reich, in his book, How the Cold War Transformed Philosophy of Science, refers to this text as a swan song of radical philosophy. Right, that this text was written at a time when the ways in which anti-communist hysteria in the United States was really at a moment when academics in the United States were losing their jobs because of their perceived ties to communism. In fact, one of the editors of this volume lost his position because of his former communism and his refusal to name names to the McCarthy Commission. What was it actually called? House Commission on Un-American Activities, I believe it was called at the time. So this is a remarkable text. Let me sort of share with you quickly some of the names that appear in this. Now, for many of you, I suspect the major name that will be familiar from the table of contents is the name of the Hungarian Marxist philosopher György Lukács, who appears in this volume as having written a Marxist critique of existentialism that very much repeats the central themes of his text, The Destruction of Reason. But many of the other philosophers who appear in this are, in a way, the great names of mid-20th century Anglophone Marxism, which was a tradition that was actually much more represented in the UK than in the States. Among the very well-known British Marxists who appear in this volume are the historian Benjamin Farrington, the biologist J.B.S. Haldane. Let's see here. Who else appears in here? J.D. Bernal, a very well-known British communist. We also have anthropologists represented by Leslie White, a fairly well-known at the time sort of evolutionarily minded anthropologist, doing evolutionary anthropology at a time before evolutionary thinking was rejected from cultural anthropology. Maurice Cornforth also appears in here with a critique of logical empiricism. Cornforth being a very sort of interesting figure who begins as a student of Wittgenstein's and then becomes a Marxist, and actually authors a very interesting response to Karl Popper. All right, Karl Popper's anti-Marxist polemic, The Open Society and Its Enemies, receives a very interesting criticism by Cornforth. So there are people who appear in this volume who at the time would have been fairly well-known figures in Anglophone Marxism, and not just Anglophone Marxism. And the editors of this volume are Roy Woodsellers, V.J. McGill being the person who lost his position at, I believe, Hunter College, and then also Marvin Farber. Farber himself being a rather interesting figure, somewhat unjustly neglected. Farber starts his career as one of Edmund Husserl's last and very few American students. And at Husserl's request, Farber brings Jahrbuch für Phänomenologie over to the United States, where it is rebranded as Philosophy and Phenomenological Research, a journal that still exists today. Farber sort of starts off his career as a phenomenologist, but ends his career as a Marxist. And in fact, his last major book is in many respects an analytic phenomenologically informed, analytically rigorous, how to put this, reconstruction or rewriting, you know, I'd say, of Lenin's Materialism and Imperial Criticism. So you have these philosophers who are writing at a time when anti-communist hysteria is ramping up in the United States, but they are fully committed to advertising themselves as modern materialists. And so here I sort of have some notes from the foreword that here's what they think that project means. They think that project is going to involve the priority of the inorganic over the organic. It's going to distinguish itself from previous materialism by way of a commitment to the theory of levels, right? So the inorganic is, as it were, the base, the most fundamental level of sort of explanatory level of reality. But then sort of built on top of that, you have the biological or the organic. Built on top of that, you have the cultural or the social or the psychological. And nothing can happen at any one level that violates the laws of a previous level, but you still have a kind of emergentism. You have an emergentism of laws. So novel new laws will emerge at a level that were not present at a previous, more basic level. And this idea of the sort of emergentism of laws that, as they see it, makes their materialism modern and different, right? It makes it a rejection of both mechanism as well as a rejection of vitalism. And there's a lot going on in this period of thought where a lot of people want to, the back and forth, the seesaw between mechanism and vitalism, which has defined a great deal of Western philosophy of biology, science, and metaphysics. This is something that in this period, a lot of people have become tired of. You find a lot of people writing in this time, seeing their project as overcoming the stalemate between vitalism and mechanism. This is actually a prominent theme of people writing in the 1940s. And so, for example, if one were to read work by Norbert Wiener, the cyberneticists, he explicitly says cybernetics is overcoming this stalemate. And there were other philosophers involved in the cybernetics movement who say very similar things, like what we're doing is overcoming the stalemate. This is an actual theme of this entire period of American thought. And here, Sotos, McGill, and Farber are contributing to this, but also saying what we're going to be doing is we are going to be combating agnosticism, skepticism, and irrationalism. So it's a very aggressive, very forward-thinking philosophy. It's very optimistic. It's very about using science and technology to make human life better. I also wanted to share with you one last quote. Let me see here, where there's a particular funny moment. Oh, yes, here it is. They take pains to distinguish themselves from naturalism. And they actually take quite pains to distinguish what we're doing. We're materialists, we're not naturalists. And they think of that as actually something very important for their project. They also write, like naturalism, modern materialism is opposed to any other criterion of human value and policy besides human needs and aspirations. It combats all forms of authoritarianism in morals and arts, opposes reduction of ethics to mere formalism, and rejects the appeal to any supposed supernatural sorts of experience. With the removal of supernatural perspective, man must stand constantly on his own feet, let him rise to his full stature and dignity. So there's a lot here that sort of sounds it's very much in keeping with themes that might be familiar with, not just from Engels, but also from Ludwig Feuerbach and other sort of that kind of putting scientific anthropology in the service of satisfying human desires and needs. Now, they then go on to distinguish their view from naturalism, right? Where they say, unfortunately, historical forms of naturalism have often been distinguished by their readiness to compromise or consciously to set limits to the use of scientific method. The naturalism of Herbert Spencer was tempered by his agnosticism. The same may be said of Huxley. And they sort of go on to sort of say, like, there are many ways in which people come to those naturalists fall short of being as aggressive in their pursuit of scientific methods as they should have been. They explicitly criticize social Darwinism for its dangerous confusion of biological and social concepts. And they refer to Pearson and Kidd. I would need to double check this, so please don't quote me. You can fact check me if you wish. I believe Pearson and Kidd in this forward are referring to people who at the time were actually quite notorious eugenicists. I believe this is a reference to eugenics.
Yeah, it is.
And that these people extolled or apologized for social conflicts in the name of biological values. Right. Hegel, a pantheist, was also a naturalist. And they, to indicate the scope of the polemics that they're engaged in, they reference this recent volume, Naturalism and the Human Spirit, a volume published in, I believe, 1948. A book that, among other things, introduced the word naturalism to philosophy. Naturalism being introduced explicitly as a big tent under which materialists and agnostics could comfortably fit together. But they select this one particular quote from that book. I can give you the exact reference if you wish as to where this is from, where they sort of say the naturalist is someone who is much more critical of old metaphysics than of someone who's proposing anything new. And that's why they say, that's why we're not naturalists. We're modern materialists. We are proposing a new metaphysics that is informed by our best contemporary science. We are committing ourselves to, quote, a synoptic view of man and the universe implicit in the sciences at their present stage of development. Okay. This point, what do you do? I'm going to stop the share at this point. And take a look at what we have in the comments. Yes, Carl Pearson. That's right. Yeah, no, that's a good point, Stephen, about Soderford, about Lukács. Right, and that's sort of the main thing. That's sort of the smoking. That's sort of the thing that put me onto this entire line of investigation. Right, like how might we read Wilfrid Sellars when we notice that an early text of his that arguably contains in a nucleus a lot of his project, appears in this sort of very aggressive manifesto of scientific socialism. There's a question here from Richard. Was it a metaphysics guided with science or guided by? What was the relation? I take it this is a question about how these people saw the project. Like, what was the materialist answer to that question?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's a good question. I think that they had I don't think, my understanding of what these people thought they were doing is to say that the way to do metaphysics, correctly, we might say, the project of a scientific metaphysics is a project that, on the one hand, has some historical continuity with what metaphysics used to be, so providing a kind of comprehensive synoptic view of the humanity and its place in the universe. But it's one that is informed by the best sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, sociology, anthropology, economics, and it doesn't invoke any notions that are without support from the sciences. Okay. Steve, you have this interesting question here about whether we notice the views of this general in chemistry periodicals like Science, like New Masses at the time. That's a very nice question. I like that question. And the short answer is I don't know. One thing I can tell you is that there were numerous, there's a range of left-wing periodicals at this time in American history, both American and UK history. So a range of left-wing Anglophone periodicals. Probably these days, the best known of them would be the journal Partisan Review. One journal in particular that I think is kind of interesting for this kind of project is a journal, I believe a UK journal, called Science and Society. Right, Science this book was favorably reviewed in Science and Society, although not elsewhere. In fact, the book in general got very critical reviews. In fact, I believe Roy Wood Sellers was very disappointed by how critical the negative reaction received. But Science and Society was one journal that was sort of very emphatically committed to a Marxist perspective on science. Like, the project of the journal was, we are Marxist scientists committed to dialectical materialism, committed to socialism, and we are going to be we're going to be using our scientific expertise to advance the project of scientific socialism. So Science and Society is one of those journals that, and many people in this volume contributed to that journal. And it was this edited, and it was sort of reviewed there. But I think it raises an interesting question, how it was received in other communist periodicals at the time. I think it's a nice question. I believe we also have question, hand from Michael. Michael Zach?
Yeah, I was wondering, there's a line that I thought was really interesting in the introduction to Philosophy for the Future that says, dialectical materialism, on the other hand, has continued its development and today exerts enormous influence. It is a matter of regret to the editors that an article on this subject cannot be obtained in time. I am new to Sellers, McDowell, Brandom, so I'm sure that this kind of line of thought will get developed throughout the rest of this seminar, but I was wondering if you could say more about how these modern materialists view their relationship to dialectical materialism, what makes it a sort of separate, kind of distinct subject within their project or related to their project, compared to Engels, who I assume views it as identical with modern materialism, or maybe I'm mistaken on that. But yeah, I was just wondering if you could say more about that aspect.
Yeah, so this is a really nice question. And unfortunately, I can't say a lot about it because I feel like that's one of the big questions I myself have not yet resolved to my own satisfaction, right? Which is like, okay, how do these people see themselves in relation to dialectical materialism? And what do they even think that meant? I mean, I can tell you that Roy Wood Sellers himself did write very sympathetically about dialectical materialism. In fact, I noticed, I've not looked at this myself, but Roy Wood Sellers is one of the very few American philosophers about whom Soviet philosophers were writing interesting commentaries as late as the 1960s. So Sellers himself, so Roy Wood Sellers is certainly very sympathetic to dialectical materialism. But I also think that there is among people like Sellers a concern. And this concern was raised, I know, particularly by the American philosopher Sidney Hook, about dialectical materialism. And the concern is this: what makes dialectical materialism any different from just being a responsible, good scientist and taking the sciences seriously? I mean, I think that there's this really remarkable passage in Sellers's intellectual autobiography, where he says that he became a philosopher. He realized it's a funny passage. He's talking about his own history, his own journey in philosophy, and he says that at one point, I believe sometime in the 1930s, he was reading Trotsky and Marx, Engels, and Lenin while studying in Paris. And it was upon talking about those with his father that he realized that his father was a philosopher. He had not realized his own father was a philosopher until talking with his dad about Trotsky and Engels and Lenin. But he also says in that same passage that his father disabused him of, I believe the phrase is, pseudo-scientific nature philosophy. Now, I myself think there's probably a lot more to be said in defense of that than Sellers lets on. Although maybe they had good reasons for not taking it seriously at the time that they were rejecting it. So I want to sort of present that not as a smoking gun, but rather as perhaps a piece of evidence that one of the reasons why they might have been skeptical of dialectical materialism and not taking that on as the same as their own project is because they might have seen in the kind of stuff that you see in Engels a bit more of romantic nature philosophy than what they think would be rationally or empirically defensible, given the sciences of their time. Okay, I think we have a hand from Richard.
I was just going to say that I think at the time in the immediate post-war era, dialectical materialism in particular had become, because it's the name of a book by Stalin, so it had become the propagated kind of dogma of international socialism, or like the Comintern, rather than the kind of living method of kind of critique that it would have been in kind of previous iterations. So maybe the phrase in particular is something to be kind of averted in the 1940s, rather than setting up a particular opposition between the method of dialectical materialism as practiced by Marx or Engels or Lenin even, as opposed to just this kind of Stalinist reification or something.
Well, that's a good point. I think there's something to that. But I'm not entirely sure that the editors of this volume would entirely, although that's certainly become a widely held view, and I think that's probably something too that's basically right. I guess I'm not entirely sure how much editors of the volume would have agreed with that, though, because it's interesting that they say it is a matter of regret to the editors that an article on this subject could not be obtained in time. Now, I don't know exactly what they have in mind by that. It probably is the case, though, that to some extent, by the time they're writing this in 1949, my guess is that probably to some extent by that time, philosophically sophisticated Soviet, there's that's kind of the low point, the nadir of Soviet philosophy, right? That's sort of the point at which, from that point, all of the great Soviet innovators in Marxism have been silenced or marginalized, killed, so on. And the resurgence of Soviet philosophy that we may be more familiar with today has not yet taken place. So it's not so clear. Yeah. Basically, Carol. Yeah. But more either that or probably more plausibly, my guess is that I also don't know to what extent these Anglophone philosophers were really aware of the situation of dialectical materialism in Soviet in the USSR at that time, and if they were fully aware of the extent to which sort of Diamat had become such a reified piece of propaganda that people who were informed and sort of actually good at that kind of thing, I don't even know who the great Soviet philosophers would really be in between Bukharin, who was killed in what, 29, and Dialectics, who is really does not begins his career in early 70s. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, what's interesting, of course, is that, and yeah, you're right. I mean, I also would point out, this is a period where the great, Soviet, Anglophone philosophy, Anglophone Marxism is still going strong, right? Haldane is defending it, Bernal is defending it, Farrington. Like, this is a really interesting period, interesting moment, when Anglophone Marxism is still really going strong. 38. Thank you. So, right, Anglophone Marxism is still going strong, especially in the UK. There are people trained who, there's a whole legacy of British Marxism that really begins with Eleanor Marx, that begins with, and her husband, that begins with Engels. Engels has two wives, both Irish, both fighting for Irish independence in this time period. Right, there's a whole legacy of Anglophone Marxism, beginning with Marx and Engels themselves. Haldane and Bernal are continuing that legacy in this time period. In a way, you can almost think of Roy Wood as the American representative of that British Marxist tradition. So it's a very interesting period, and of course, it's also a period when the Cold War is ending people's careers. Okay, so how about this? It's almost 10 o'clock. I would like to take maybe a short break of perhaps 5 minutes. We might resume at 10:05. Okay, very good. Okay. So I think I'm happy to resume. I've been looking at some things in the chat that you guys have been mentioning. I believe it's Laila. You have a question?
Lika.
Lita, thank you.
Sorry, I think I have a comment on the part that we mentioned earlier about the Marxist dialectics. And I wouldn't link the term materialist dialectics to Stalin because there is a difference between the doctrine of Diamat that he forced and the philosophy of dialectical materialism. And I know, for instance, that there was a group of philosophers in the 20s who actually were doing this collection of works where they wanted to use the dialectical materialism from young Marx and to apply to different strands of human knowledge, and they wanted to refute idealism and mechanical worldview. And yes, in this regard, they are very close, I think, to new materialists as we see them in Roy Wood's collection of papers. But yes, I know also stories that those particular philosophers who I mentioned, at one point, Stalin himself, he realized that he wants to be a philosopher, and he invited them to talk to him so they would accept him as a philosopher, but they did not. They said that you are not philosopher at all. By way of your reasoning, I see that. So of course he repressed them, and they were killed. And that is, one of the reasons why I wouldn't recommend anyone to read their papers. Yes, because they didn't have the time to expound on their philosophical views, and they were under this constant pressure. That's why they weren't so successful as the American philosophers in those questions, and they were compelled, to instead of doing philosophy, to link materialism to politics of their time. Yeah, this group I know because the leader, one of the leaders of this group is Nikolai Karev. He has the same surname as I do, Kareva.
Yeah, I mean, from what I understand, the guy who tried to teach Stalin dialectics was sharp. But bringing up what Carl mentioned before, that Sellers was having a conversation with his dad about Trotsky, Lenin, Engels, and Marx. It kind of sounds like that might have been the Anglophone debates around the SWP, around the bulletins in defense of Marxism. That being said, Trotsky there is using, at the same time, better definitions of dialectical materialism to think it was the guy that brought it up before, Michael, I don't know. Slightly better, but still very opportunistic, like readings of dialectical materialism and the method to try and push his like politics to the party line. But there's some interesting debates around like the contemporary predominant philosophy of positivism, pragmatism, and empiricism in the Anglophone world. But yeah, I'm not sure how relevant it is, but I think probably coming out of that sort of milieu, they're talking about dialectical materialism and trying to formulate new materialism.
Sorry, that was very helpful. Thank you. My muted stuff now. Okay. So I want to look something up real quick to share with you. Some maybe some amusement. I made this comment earlier about how Sellers discovered philosophy, Wilford, and here is the passage I think I can find online. I think it's most of Sellers is online, but here's the passage I would like to share. This is an autobiographical reflection that he had written in, when was this written? An autobiographical reflection that Wilford wrote in 1975. So he is in talking about studying in Paris in 1930. And he says, so I was in Paris when the stock market crashed. By this time, I made the acquaintance of a Jewish boy, also a student at the Lycée, who had been educated in England. We gravitated together and were soon boon companions. He had friends who were Marxist in ideology, but to the extent they were politically involved, strongly anti-Stalinist. Boris Souvarine, I don't know if you know this name. I looked him up myself. He's apparently a fairly well-known Trotskyite of the time period. I'll put the name in the chat for you, because I'm sure my pronunciation is not correct. Was the immediate source of ideological influence, although on the horizon was Trotsky, who had just been sent into exile. I, of course, was a complete novice in these matters, but I was soon reading Marxist classics and adding, I can't really pronounce French very well, La Humanité and Le Populaire to my daily surfeit of newspapers. Okay. Aaron, do you know more about this person? Can you share?
No. I'm just always amused by the way that these figures change their sort of take on pen names, similar to in the Freud class earlier when we were talking about Sandor Ferenczi, who's of course like Alexander Frankel or whatever. This sort of embarrassing Polish Yiddish names.
Right, no,
that they,
yeah. The ways in which everyone is sort of sort of.
Yeah. Well, here in his last name, I'm like,
concealing their Jewish origin. It's quite
something doesn't
yes.
fit here. Yeah.
Yeah. Wilford then continues. My first serious reading of philosophy, then such as it was in Marx, Engels, Lenin, and in general, the philosophical and quasi-philosophical polemical literature, which is the lifeblood of French intellectuals. He then writes a bit later on, needless to say, I found my father's views congenial from the start and quickly sloughed off the pseudo-Hegelian jargon of Marxist Naturphilosophie. More resistant, as they should have been, were the Hegelian overtones of Marxism as a scheme of historical explanation. So I think there's something interesting, so this is sort of interesting to sort of thinking here, not just about Wilfrid as, a Kantian philosopher or as a Hegelian philosopher, although those are very dominant interpretations, but rather to notice that, when Wilfred is starting to do philosophy, he is coming in at a time when you already have a long-standing tradition of many philosophers, such as Marx and Engels and Lenin, and in the American scene, although quite different, John Dewey, who are taking Hegelian themes and transposing those Hegelian themes into a naturalistic framework. And so I'm sort of interested in the ways in which, and so one of the things I want to be able to explore both in this class and other things I'm working on is the ways in which, the return to Hegel that has been conducted by Salarzian philosophers such as Brandom and McDowell might be seen as a reversion, as a going back against where Sutherland himself had already gotten to in the 1950s and 1960s. And I think it's always a nice question to be posing, whether that has something to do with the class position of American academics, of which, of course, I am one. I see we have a hand from Richard.
Sorry, what is that class position? I feel like I don't understand. I don't know.
Oh, I see. Namely that American academics tend to be very much part of what a sort of a professional middle class. We tend to be heavily invested in progressive politics, but only so progressive up to a point. Certainly left by American standards, for whatever that's worth. If you know American politics, you may remember a brief-lived campaign. You might remember the name Elizabeth Warren. This is a very sort of Elizabeth Warren, currently a senator, I believe, from Massachusetts, senator, right? Who was sort of had a bit of fame as someone who might have been able to push the Democrats in a more progressive direction, but at the same time, not by any means representative of a socialist tradition, which you do have in the United States to some very limited extent. Yes, wonkish progressivism, that's exactly right. That is very much in keeping, I think, with how American academics conduct themselves and very much how they see the world. So I think that's right. And I think it's an interesting question and I think it's always an interesting question. If we're going to be, we might sort of, it's an interesting question to be thinking about here, whether that wonkish progressivism that is very standard in how American academics think might be then informing the ways in which analytic, the shape in which that American Hegelianism analytic Hegelianism has taken. That's the only point I was trying to make there. No, yeah, okay, fair enough. Yeah. Okay, Stephen, a hand from Stephen?
Yeah, so just kind of on this point, both about kind of Sellers, Wilfred's political background and also this question of class position. Wilfred's wife, possibly his second wife, I'm not sure, Susanna Felder Downey also has a little kind of biographical essay on Wilfred that you can find online, part of which kind of the most substantial part is kind of dedicated to his last years and the toll that alcoholism took on him. But she also has a little discussion about his politics that also leads into this question of kind of class and professional position. So let me just read a little bit from this. Also, the description of their courtship, I think would get Wilfred sort of Me Too'd in the contemporary era, I think rightly so. It's not an ideal courtship for my position. So what does she say? He was the first man I had ever been involved with who wasn't afraid of me or who didn't try to change me in some way, nor put me in a little, very restricted box marked woman and try to confine me to his arbitrary definition. I was at that time a fledgling feminist, and Wilfred was 100% supportive of my increasingly radical politics. In fact, I think he got a great deal of vicarious enjoyment out of my NOW meetings, National Organization for Women, and my various feminist activities, since he had a lively and very open sense of political history and a fine appreciation of progressive values and movements. He told me once that he almost went into politics in the sense of devoting substantial energies to political activity when he was at Minnesota, and shared the platform on some occasion with Hubert Humphrey, whom he found much to his liking. But he knew his philosophical star was rising rapidly, and he stayed the academic course, fortunately for all of us. So besides the evidence about kind of political background there, it's also interesting that he has this awareness of his professional and kind of philosophical trajectory, and he's making decisions about how much to be involved in politics, maybe even how much to reference politics within his work for that reason.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting point. By the way, I threw in the chat the link to this obituary. It is Susanna Fielder Downey, her Sellers' second wife, her obituary for him. Yeah, I think he also does mention in his intellectual biography that at one point he did actually briefly campaign for Norman Thomas, sort of agrarian socialist of the sort of 1930s. The kind of person who was in favor of sort of, land reform and getting, ending the power of big banks over family farms, that kind of thing. Yeah, so thank you for bringing our attention to that. Yeah, and I believe also at one story he founded a he also, I believe, founded a co-op in Michigan, right? I believe it's actually referenced on the Wikipedia page for him. Yeah, so he certainly was very had left-wing sympathies. You can also, if you look at you can find, where exactly do you find this? I'd have to look at the link. But you can find online a list of all of the books in his library at University of Pittsburgh. And several volumes in that are devoted to issues in Marxist and Marxist philosophy. So he was certainly always adjacent to Marx and Marxism. I would never want to go so far as to say that he was a Marxist. I would never go that far. I do think that there's an interesting question about whether his left-wing political sympathies might inform his philosophical views more deeply than has been widely recognized. I'd put it that way. Okay. Are there any questions or thoughts, comments from anyone who has not yet spoken up today?
I kind of have two broad ones that I think would open up discussion, but if anyone else wants to go first,
yeah,
or
I don't
have
see
more
else.
specific.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So these definitely relate back to some of the work going on into previous seminars. Just so sorry for people for whom that might be a bit of a stretch or not following, but many of you are. So the first question I kind of wanted to open up was what we had started discussing before on this idea of like philosophy and anti-philosophy, right? From Daniel's set of seminars, or viewing philosophy and naturalism as sort of competing projects, right? Or at odds in some ways. Yeah, the way that this often gets, I guess Badiou is one person who's kind of made this argument talking about anti-philosophers, people opposed to the idea of a kind of Platonic conception of philosophy, a conception of contemplation and reflective philosophical life as separate from practice, right? You can have this whole Nietzschean tradition, and the question is whether it's proper, I guess, here to consider Marx and Marxism as part of that tradition or not. That's kind of the first broad question and area of discussion that I think is important for this. Like, do we consider Marxism to be a set of ideas that belongs to the tradition of philosophy? Do we consider it to be something that is part of this kind of counter current anti-philosophical tradition, similar to Nietzsche and post-Nietzschean philosophy? It's a really relevant question for talking about Pittsburgh, Chicago neo-Hegelianism, because Richard Rorty is also a kind of very important figure in this tradition. Brandom still refers to him as his Dr. Vater, right? So he's kind of a big daddy there. I have more I could say on that, but I rather open it up as a discussion than give my take. But the second question I also want to put out before we do that is to allude to something that actually Ray Brassier said in his last seminar about his interpretation of Marx on this, because I think it's useful. He said that in his understanding, Marx's philosophy or Marx's sort of work takes up a materialism of practice rather than a materialism of substance, right? And he makes that his distinction in how he reads Marx as not at odds with the philosophical tradition, as a sort of continuation of Hegel and Hegelianism, sort of working toward a philosophical goal of a rational form of social life, but with a materialism of practice and an emphasis on philosophy as a practice rather than a contemplative tradition. I'm sympathetic to that, but it really makes a pointed question to Carl of how you interpret materialism as a term, and how sort of this materialism sits in relation to other ways of thinking about materialism, particularly the kind of French psychoanalytic informed materialism or the Frankfurt School psychoanalytic informed materialism. And we could have this whole debate about whether it's better to use naturalism or materialism. Just sort of historically, this is an interesting argument for materialism over naturalism. And then within a decade, materialism is completely eclipsed by naturalism, right? Like, and naturalism kind of wins out. So I guess those are the two areas where I think we could have real interesting discussion here. Anyone free to respond.
Yeah, so there's this quote that appeared in the chat by, I'm sure I'll get your name wrong, Mislav?
Yes, Mstislav.
Ah, thank you. Mislav. So thank you for this quote from German Ideology. It's very sort of interesting to sort of think about right, what do they think the word philosophy means in this quote? Right. Right.
I suppose they're criticizing the bourgeois political philosophy of their time.
Well, right. Right, but that's right. But they want to sort of, I mean, like one way of reading this would be to say, right, And of course, bear in mind, they're writing, of course, in German ideology, they have their particular people they're arguing against, right? They're writing against Bruno Bauer, against Feuerbach, against Max Stana, right? So they're arguing, they are in close quarters pitched battle against the young Hegelians, right? But they also see that they also think there's something, generally speaking, the young Hegelians are making this general problem, namely that they are concerned with abstractions in themselves, considering these abstractions divorced from real history, but those abstractions have no value. Abstractions are only useful to facilitate arrangement of historical material, but we are not to be given a recipe or schema for trimming the epochs of history. The difficulties begin only when one sets about the examination, the arrangement. On the contrary, difficulties begin only when one sets about the examination and arrangement of the material, whether a past epoch or the present in its actual presentation. Right. And I also think it's this, and I think it's interesting, this general question that Aaron has raised for us about like how. So one question might, okay, so one question would be, how do Marx and Engels see themselves? Do they see themselves as doing philosophy at all? That's one question. Another question might be, what are some different positions within the history of Marxism for how they understand Marxism and philosophy? And so you can look at the people with whom I personally would be familiar would be Sidney Hook, Herbert Marcuse, and Karl Korsch, all of whom I think have different but related views about how to understand the relationship between Marxism and philosophy. Of those, I think Marcuse is clearest in stating presenting the following thesis, that Marxism is the attempt to realize in practice what for philosophy has been realized only in theory. And so that idea, and I think that actually I think fits on rather nicely with the opening sentence of Negative Dialectics by Adorno, right? Philosophy lives on because the moment of realization was missed. Right, so at least that would be one way of thinking about how Marxism is, what makes Marxism different from philosophy and not philosophy is that Marxism attempts to take these philosophical ideals, notions of, say, justice or freedom or equality, and to implement them, to actually build a society in which those ideals are realized concretely and for everyone, and not just describe these ideals in a very from a kind of contemplative position, the way arguably philosophers from Plato to Hegel had done. So that'd be one way of taking, would be one response. That'd be one way of thinking about these things. But I would be very careful not to say all anti-philosophers are on the same camp, so to speak. I mean, in some sense, right, Nietzsche, of course, is notoriously critical of previous philosophers. But I would be very hesitant to align Nietzsche's criticisms of philosophy with Marx's criticisms of philosophy. I'd be very hesitant. I myself would be very hesitant to do that for all sorts of reasons. Marx is mostly owing to the Marxist critique of Nietzsche, which I think is very interesting and very insightful. And then there's, of course, what Rorty is doing, which is very much his own project that's very much committed to his own way of thinking about the history of philosophy, right? Rorty has a whole philosophy of history, in which he wants to say philosophy culminated in the logical empiricism. And logical empiricism was committed to two doctrines: the analytic synthetic distinction and the given. And that those two doctrines were rejected each by one of the following: Sellers and Quine. But so Rorty thinks that each of them upheld the pillar that was rejected by the other one. Sellers upheld the analytic synthetic distinction, which Quine rejected, and Quine, in his own way, retained the given, which Sellers rejected. That's Rorty, and then Rorty ends up saying like they had to do this because to reject both of those pillars together would have been to reject logical empiricism as such. It would have been undermined the whole rationale of analytic philosophy as a distinct academic discipline, and that would have been the end of philosophy as such, as a distinct academic discipline. So Rorty himself has a whole particular story there that's very different from the kind of stories you're going to get from Marx or Engels or Badiou or anyone else.
I guess just on that, no, I totally agree that there are very separate streams sort of coming together. It's just an interesting way of categorizing it because it forces you to come up with a sort of definition of philosophy as a project, right? And have to sort your thinkers in what they think that's doing. But I just want to call attention to an interesting parallel here, actually. Because Rorty, in telling that story that you just described, sort of sets that in a trajectory, a bigger trajectory of what sort of analytic and continental 20th century philosophy, basically making the same mistakes as Hegel and Husserl, right? He's saying basically we started to get sort of Darwinian evolutionary scientific naturalism in the late 19th century. We had people like Dewey and Peirce doing pragmatism. And then we had these two sort of notorious sort of demonic conceptual innovations that trapped us, right? And we're only getting away from it and getting back to the good naturalist pragmatism now, which is in some ways kind of the going back to Roy Wood, we're sort of making a similar step, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. And for those of you who don't know Rorty all that well, I do want to sort of add to this, embellish this comment that Aaron just shared with us. Right, Rorty has a very interesting conception of the history of philosophy, right, in which he sort of says, by the end of this is almost verbatim from his work on 1979, Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, where he says, well, by the end of the 19th century, you basically had this sort of very relaxed evolutionary naturalism. Everybody was sort of on the same page. You've got Dewey, you've got Spencer, you've got Gasson, you've got everyone sort of talking as if, well, we're not going to really worry about these very deeply entrenched disciplinary distinctions all that much. But then things go in the wrong direction, is where he sees it, with Husserl and Russell and Frege, who are sort of saying, well, there's something wrong here. Now, one thing that Rorty does not say, although it's also absolutely necessary for understanding what Rorty is right about, is that there was this long-standing argument within German academic philosophy at that time about psychology, and about whether psychology was a branch of philosophy or not. And there's for those of you curious about this, there's a superb book by Martin Kusch called Psychologism, And it is a remarkable study in the sociology of German philosophy at this time period. And it's all about how this label psychologism is constructed in this time period for these political reasons, because German academic chairs were so limited and they're all being filled by psychologists. And then the non-psychological philosophers were like, well, wait a minute. We need, what about us? What about our students? And so this is very interesting time period in German academic culture when psychology is emerging as a distinct field, but is it a branch of philosophy, or is it a natural science, or is it something else? And so there are these very much unsettled questions, and then you have people like, but it is also true that Frege and Husserl come up with arguments against psychologism that then get quickly taken up because of the need to distinguish psychology from philosophy. And then that project then helps give birth to logical empiricism. Yes, okay, thank you. Okay, I think, Emil, you've had a hand up for a while.
Yeah, I was just gonna I kind of wonder with the anti-philosophy, I'm not too familiar, but isn't it just a term kind of used by Bourdieu retroactively to categorize a bunch of different philosophers, like Pascal's in there, like Marx is in there. So it's kind of just, I don't know that Engels would consider himself an anti-philosopher in so much as so like a scientist. And I just wonder how relevant it is as a debate. Like, and I guess his whole point being that he's just trying to, an anti-philosopher is someone who's opposed to philosophy because they don't really have, like, their whole project is on debasing an overarching theory of truth. And you know, if it's particularly useful to try and retroactively conceptualize these people now outside of Bourdieu. Yeah.
Oh, I see. So the question is here is like, if anti-philosophy is a term Bourdieu uses to mean something quite specific, then how much does that concept really generalize beyond Bourdieu's use of it?
Is it useful to take it outside of the context of Bourdieu's system? Like, because Bourdieu's incorporating them sort of analogous to philosophy as almost a challenge to philosophy, to then retroactively, like, not retroactively, to kind of re-theorize what a philosophy would do. But he's always kind of inspired and influenced by his anti-philosophers. Like and I don't know, like if you're getting Pascal there, I don't think Pascal would consider himself like an anti-philosopher, but you know what I mean? Like I kind of want, I guess my question was for you again, I kind of want to return back a bit. How would you specifically distinguish between historical materialism, or the historical materialism of Marx, and dialectical materialism of Engels? Because I know that there was a lot of debates and a lot of people don't use, even today, iffy about using dialectical materialism. And it was kind of ridiculed, at least in those debates with Trotsky, by the sort of American pragmatist inspired leftists, like I think Burnham, as what was it? As like some sort of wily mysticism that could explain anything.
Yeah.
Rick. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a really nice question, and I don't really, you know, it's always a challenge, I think, for people in the you know, I mean, it is perhaps somewhat shocking to realize that we are over 20 years well into the 21st century. And so those of us in our 40s and younger who are looking back at these 20th century debates, or older, it's always sort of a little bit weird to say, well, what were they really arguing about, and why were they really arguing about it? Like, what was really going on? And I think when it comes, I think, and I make that sort of a general remark, but then we also, we have to sort of learn, we have to learn how to be good historians of philosophy, of stuff that happened, well into, current living memory, but maybe not our living memories, but people who are alive now, right? We have to be good historians. What were they really thinking about? What were they really arguing about? What's driving them into these different positions? So yes, you're certainly right that I believe the widely mysticism remark is, I believe, Sidney Hook, if I recall correctly. And Hook has his own reasons, right, for rejecting dialectical materialism. He has his own reasons for rejecting the idea about dialectics of nature. This is a time period when a lot of political forces shaped by the Cold War are giving rise to this good Marx, bad Engels kind of mythology that has shaped a lot of how this discourse has evolved. And so you have a lot of people then saying, well, you have Marx, he's just being a good historian, and we're just, that's the good stuff. And all that stuff about dialectic nature and all that, that's the bad stuff. That leads to Lysenko. You don't want to do that. Don't go there, right? And that gives rise, and that of course is, that's highly arguable in many ways, and there's a long history in which, right, the certain themes and dialectics of nature do actually come back into Anglophone discourse. Most prominently with this book from was it mid-80s by Levins and Lewontin, the dialectical biologist, right, which is a book that actually has not gotten much attention from philosophers, although among philosophers of biology, it gets a lot of attention. Mostly because in that book, they invent the idea of niche construction, which has since gone on to become a very highly regarded theory within a concept within evolutionary theory. Although the Marxist origins of that concept are never mentioned. So there's a lot going on there. It's all very complicated. Yeah, Emil?
I'm going to pop in briefly. Sorry, I'm holding Kirill up, and I'll shut up after this. But don't you think that Lewontin's arguments really, is it just those stories? No, not just those stories. I kind of find he seems way more Kantian, like Critique of Pure Reason, with this a sort of critical appraisal of evolutionary narratives. It's like, as if arguments marry it really well with just those stories in Lewontin, if we're talking about Lewontin. But yeah.
Oh, I see. Yeah, there might be something there. I'd have to go back and think about, we might have to sort of have a bit of a chat outside of class or over email about whether he is more, Lewontin ends up being more Kantian than Marxist. Well, we can sort of think about that. I like the question there, for sure. I only mentioned Lewontin just to sort of indicate that there's a complicated story here about how these narratives get constructed, and certainly it becomes part. It becomes part of Cold War rhetoric that dialectical materialism. Oh, that's that bad stuff that Engels started that we don't do over here. We're just good Marxists. We're just historical materialists. But I think we should be very skeptical of how we, in the 21st century, allow Cold War narratives to frame our understanding of what Marx and Engels were really doing and how closely aligned they were. And my understanding, for whatever it's worth, is that Marx himself fully understood and approved and admired what Engels was doing, and was a big enthusiast supporter of that project. So the idea that Engels had his own project that Marx might have been approved of, I think that they really saw themselves as cooperative here. And I think that Marx, to an extent, was just willing to say, oh yeah, no, Frederick, it's what you're doing with physics and chemistry and biology, that's great. You should do more of that. I'm doing this thing over here with economics. I believe, Kirill, you're next and you have your hand up.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, this is just a very simple point, but I don't think we've explicitly mentioned it. Just the other thread that comes in here, uniting this, and that's, I think it's where Marx can really be seen in some ways as the opposite of someone like John McDowell. It's just the point that's overquoted in the thesis of Feuerbach that philosophers have only interpreted the world, and the point is to change it. The point there being, so in the quote that you gave of Engels, he's saying there's no philosophy above science. So what happens is it becomes a part of that project. So Ilienkov's interpretation of that aspect of Engels is, well, so if we're saying that the logic of dialectics is something in the world, not in people's heads, and if philosophy is changing the world, then philosophy needs to be treated as a science, and we shouldn't create these boundaries between science and philosophy. Ideally, these would just be sort of continuous, but yeah, just that point of like where it's like comes off as anti-philosophy is the mainly talking about German idealists, but the sense that, well, if you're a philosopher, then you're just sort of doing interpretation that's potentially kind of not updating itself to what the science and the concrete practices are showing is the case, or it's not changing those things.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting point about what we mean by philosophy and how we're going to define philosophy such that as the converse of anti-philosophy, right? I mean, if by philosophy you mean having a comprehensive, rationally articulated worldview, then it's hard for me to see how Marxism would not be philosophy, right? But if by philosophy you mean a kind of contemplative, detached standpoint that you know, doesn't take into account its own material conditions of, in particular, one that does not take into account, that explicitly rejects considering its own material conditions. If that's what you mean by philosophy, and certainly there are Marx and Engels do use the word philosophy in that way, then certainly Marx and Engels might be happy to say, well, we are very proudly not anti-philosophy, but post-philosophy. Right. They might, and then a lot then depends on how much you read philosophy as something that is, I don't know. I mean, if you happen to, and certainly there's a long-standing tradition where you can read philosophers as basically continuing the project of medieval theology by other means, and continuing the project of giving an apologetics for the status quo. Sorry, I have a visitor here. See if we can get him to say. This is Oliver. Oliver, say hello to my students. So right, so like if you're reading, so like philosophy is one of those words that stretches, and so whether you, which is say like you can, how you want to use the word philosophy, how do you want to use the word philosophy, right? We can always step back and be pragmatists at a sort of second order. How do you want to use the word philosophy, and what do you want to use that word to do? Like you can use the word philosophy to mean an apologetics of the status quo, in which case Marxism is going to be post-philosophical, or you can read philosophy to mean a rationally articulated worldview, in which case a lot of Marxists will be philosophers. So I think it's always this question: what job do you want the work philosophy to do? Okay, I believe we have Richard. You have a hand?
Yeah, this is going to be quite kind of a naively posed question because I'm not sure. I'm kind of out of my depth here, but it seems that there's of course, in this kind of the line that Kirill was just quoting, the kind of from the thesis of Feuerbach, philosophers will interpret the world. The point, however, is to change it. There is a kind of motivation for change. So if we're to read Marx as still to some degree inside a kind of philosophical project, then that philosophical project contains a motivation to change the world. But if we're also to read at the same time philosophy in the Marxist sense as, in some sense, continuous with science, then it seems like that motivation to change the world is to some extent absent from the practice of science conventionally conceived. Is there a kind of discontinuity there in the sense that philosophy might be motivated in the Marxist sense by this kind of normative drive towards transformation, where that drive itself is absent from science, except so the way we can kind of marry the two, I guess, might be that we could propose immediately that the world that science studies will change itself anyway, and that the kind of maybe the basic kind of postulate of the dialectical method is that the world is always kind of coming into being and so on. And this is the interesting thing about the reference to Kant and the solar system in the text read. So I'm kind of wondering, like, what is it that grounds that motivation for change, if it is merely a kind of also almost like a cold Marxism, a kind of Marxism of, I can't remember if this is a thing in Marxist, but like, I've taught I'm kind of rambling now. So is that a clear question? Like, where's the discontinuity here? There's a motivation to change that is not simply a postulation that the world will change itself already. And if we're going to accept with the modern materialists, this rejection of eugenics for the confusion of social and natural facts, then how do we justify the distinction between the ever-changing world of science and the changing world of philosophy that is not the changing world of the social, that changes for reasons that we give it rather than changes for reasons of its own internal dynamism, with regards to which we are simply kind of observers?
No, I think it's a nicely articulated question there, a nicely articulated sort of problem, right? And I think that, like, what would be the rationale for, what kind of rationale could a modern materialist provide or offer in support of a more egalitarian or less hierarchical social structure? Like, why, after all, one might think, well, why, what's science, it's not as if there might be sort of, one might say, well, okay, hierarchical societies are less open to innovation, say, than more egalitarian societies. One can have some, but like at the end of, even I guess, and that's sort of really what I think the modern materialists are going to have to say. Whether this is true or not is another question, but I think what I have to say is something like the following. They are going to appeal to a scientific theory of human nature in order to ground the kinds of normative claims they want to make. So, right, but because what they don't want is normative claims about justice or freedom or equality or human dignity. They don't want those claims to be grounded in a supernatural metaphysics or a theological claims or anything like that. Right. Those claims have, but so what's going to ground them, I think, will have to be, on their view, basically a scientifically informed philosophical anthropology. And now, having said that, I think it's still going to be the very big question. A, is that a viable project? And secondly, could that project do the kind of normative work that they wanted to? I guess I read Marx as basically thinking the answer to this question is going to be yes. But I don't know if that's the right answer. It's also, I mean, it's certainly worth pointing out that for the Frankfurt School, the normative claims are sui generis, right? Those normative claims are grounded in German idealism, right? For those philosophers, those normative claims have their own internal logic that simply has to be married to empirical science, not grounded in empirical science. I believe we have a hand from Michael, and then it's 11:03, so this will be the last question, I think.
Well, maybe I'll feel bad wasting the last question then. But so that, to be clear, is kind of saying that I guess this still doesn't kind of square the circle for me, because if you are making normative claims in the sort of domain of the social and the natural, it's whatever, this dialectical process with the two sides of its internal logic that we observe and the reasons that we give it, as Richard put it, which I liked. If a normative claim on that level is going to be derived from a claim about human nature, then your science or your materialism needs to generate those claims somehow. But that is, I guess maybe it's a lack of familiarity with Marx or these other sort of later thinkers, but I mean, a philosophically informed anthropology could just as easily be Kant, essentially defining reason so as to exclude savages and non-Europeans and whatever. So I don't, I like it, those claims still have to come from somewhere. And as you just mentioned, if they're like sui generis in a sense, what is that logic? And does it, does it arise in a, like, whatever, a just or humanist or whatever desirable way by virtue of coming from dialectical, whatever your materialism, or is there another ingredient needed to set it on the right course?
Yeah, and we should also be, I think you're making a nice point, we should always be very cautious about, and then whenever we present a theory of rationality or present a theory of human nature, right? There's always this question of, well, whose interests is that theory serving? And that's a long-standing worry, a long-standing concern. Like one philosopher who I think is actually extremely good on that particular point is this the Caribbean philosopher Sylvia Wynter, who has a very long, but I think very interesting article, was it Unsettling the Coloniality of Being / Truth / Power / Knowledge. Very long and rather demanding article, but really quite fascinating for how it articulates precisely, yes, that's right. Thank you, Richard. How it is exactly this concern that was very nicely raised. But I think that's not to say that we must be told. That's not to say we should reject those sorts of theories entirely. We might need theories of human nature, but we should be sophisticated about them in a way that people often have not been. And yes, we do go until 11:30. I apologize. So we do have 24 minutes remaining. Are there any questions or comments from anyone else who has not yet spoken up today? Yes, Armand, please.
Yes, thank you for taking my question. I just wanted to point out two things, maybe comment on one question. A comment is really for me to understand better what we talk about exactly. We talk about dialectic here. If dialectic is the process that in its identity is dialectic, that is anything identified with itself can also be different from itself and has let's say logical structures built inside that can differentiate it from itself. Let's give it that ad hoc different for now. If we talk about that, then the process of say expanding or going over the history of an identity that has a history that is unfolds in time, then there are moments that's the thing that becomes identified to itself. It's really not itself. It's something completely else. And something completely else doesn't differ from the identified unity of let's say our study, for example, an economy. I understand the niche construction as something quite relative to this, but maybe I'm talking too long and I'm not communicating my point. Okay, that was my comment about to try to understand what dialectic we are talking about when we talk about dialectical materialism. I would love to understand that much better, because I don't think what we are talking about here is completely what Engels talked about, some Orthodox Marxists talked about. And my question is about the last one that we made it, because if we say that we have a theory of truth, say we have some kind of way, some kind of determinate way to reach the truth of the world, then we have a philosophy. If we say that we don't have this theory, have only an assertive way to get by in the world, then we cannot have something, let's say, orthodoxly philosophical. We have something practical or something like that. If we, again, like my definition or description for dialectic, we go with this description, then something becomes, in my opinion, more clear, at least to me. That when we talk about anti-philosophy or going beyond philosophy or something like that, we are talking about not changing the world, but talking about taking serious what we do as philosophy, as a thing that could be entailed and could be enforced in the world in a way that practice human or nature of a human necessarily entail in itself. That is, that's at least my understanding of it. So, sorry for taking too long. I'd love to hear you on these points.
Okay, so thank you, Armand. There's a lot there that's very rich, and there's a very suggestive comment. I mean, one strand of that comment, which I think is actually very important to, I want to sort of pull on and sort of highlight for us, is this big question about what do we mean by dialectics? And because if one might think, I mean, if you're going to be, if one were a fairly, you know, if one were to use the word dialectics in roughly the way that, say, Hegel were to use that word, then you're thinking about dialectics as a claim about the very structure of categories, right? And we're not talking about, and so the ways in which the category, so if you think about, say, the ways in which dialectics operates in the phenomenology of spirit, right? We're talking about dialectics as the ways in which a form of consciousness is riven by instabilities and is unable to do the work it claims to be doing as a form of consciousness, and that we sort of exhibit, we sort of deeply observe breakdowns in forms of consciousness, engendering increasingly more complex structures until we arrive at absolute knowing, which apparently Hegel himself had. And then, from that standpoint, we then see dialectical structures at work in both in nature and in history, but also we see a dialectics at work in the ways in which the categories themselves systematically transform, unfold at the level of thought, reflecting upon itself qua thought. There's a big claim we get in science of logic. And once you can sort of think dialectically, then you can also see dialectics sort of at work in nature and also at work in history. But I think it's an interesting question then, what happened, if you think about dialectics as sort of the laws of thought, what then happens to the very concept of dialectics once you then undergo a materialist turn and try and say with Marx and Engels, well, that's just all abstraction. That has no concrete reality. Concrete reality is what actual human beings are doing in their economic, political, religious activity. That's where dialectics is. Like, I think it becomes an interesting question then, well, what makes that dialectical? And, you know, it's an interesting question what happens when, you know, for Hegel, what really matters is the notion of contradiction. That's the central category for Hegel. That's why the connection between dialectics and dialetheism is so potent and so interesting. But if you then, I think it might be, it's one thing to say, well, in nature you see change and resistance and movement. That's one thing. If you have a metaphysics of nature that's based about basically a process ontology of nature, that's one thing. It's quite different to say that contradiction is the fundamental concept of, say, physics or biology. So what we might, at that point, we might worry, we might be losing our grip on the notion of what dialectics itself. So I think that's one. So what does dialectics, in other words, to take up the roundabout of thought, is the meaning of dialectics itself sufficiently stable as we undergo the materialist turn from Hegel to Marx, that we can just say, well, we're starting with, we're still thinking dialectically, only we're doing so materialistically rather than idealistically. I think the long-standing view among most Marxists is the answer is, well, yes, but I'm not sure that's the right answer. And that might be one reason why the modern materialists don't use the word dialectical materialism. That might be one reason why, because they do want to say, well, we're offering an ontology of organization and process and change and levels of organization. We're offering an emergence metaphysics, where what happens at the psychological level emerges from, but it's not dependent upon the biological and the physical and the chemical and the physical and so on. But maybe they don't want to use the word dialectic or materialism for their own view, because they don't want to be committed to this idea that contradiction is the fundamental concept of their process emergentist metaphysics. That would be going a bit too far for them, perhaps.
Just a side question, quick. Do you think that contradiction can be in the verb is? It's maybe it's a bit Heideggerian. I don't know. I never read very much, but do you think the contradiction itself is the way of they use the language? Because when Hegel talks about there's the tree, and says that if you turn around, then there is no tree. This is a house. There is a house. So what is doing here is not part of the word. The is part of our way of understanding the word. That's idealism, right? The part of idealism, at least, as much as I understand it. But when Marx talks about is, necessarily talks about something at a leap of belief, something like that, to my understanding, at least. That is, to take this is and isn't as something that is in the world and not something completely result of a human language or a human structure. If this is something in the world, then we can have some dialectical materialism. No? We can have some cybernetic loops, feedback loops, always going around and explain everything in the terms of feedback loops. If we have it, but the point is, don't have it, right? Like the contradiction that we talk about, it's very difficult to point to the contradiction in the matter. Very easier to point to the contradiction in the language. And I think that's very relevant to the positive ideology of system. I don't know.
Yeah, so that's a nice point, Armand, and I like that. I mean, one way of thinking about that is, so what's one thing to say, suppose with cybernetics, taken in a very broad sense to include second-order cybernetics, so taking cybernetics in a very broad sense to include, say, Gregory Bateson, or taking cybernetics in a very broad sense to include general dynamical systems theory. So it's one thing to say, our best ontology of the world, how to put this? It's one thing to say that our best scientific ontology is one of dynamics, of process, of feedback, of various kinds, at various scales, looping at different energies, and so on. And if you want to develop a kind of dynamical process ontology, I think that's one thing. It's another thing to then say the fundamental concept of our dynamical process ontology is the concept of contradiction. I think that is, there's a little bit of a slippery slope there that I think is, it's tricky, right? It's one thing to say that, and again, and it might be one thing to say that contradiction is an important concept for understanding, say, the logic of scientific progress or the logic of moral progress. But another thing to say that contradiction is something that we're going to get out of dynamical systems theory as our best scientific ontology. So I think there are going to be things. The question now, one might say, well, from the standpoint of someone who was trained within Western classical logic, from that perspective, it made sense to describe the insights of dynamical systems theory using the vocabulary of classical logic. And so contradiction ended up being the term that they used to cash out these dynamical process insights. But that's going to be still different from saying, oh, and that's also the right concept to be using to cash out those insights. Right? We might just have better tools from people like Bateson and Bertalanffy for cashing out dynamical systems theory. So maybe we don't need to be committed to dialectics as the conceptual vocabulary for doing so. I'm gonna look quickly over the chat and see if you've been talking about here. Yeah, I think I might have to say I might be inclined to both agree with Carol's response to Emil, there's still going to be a kind of explanatory gap between the normative and the descriptive. At the same time, though, I would not be I might be a little bit hesitant to overinflate the normative as distinct from the descriptive. Like one of the big problems that I'm still wrestling with, as are many other philosophers, is how you could take what's basically right in a normative versus descriptive distinction, but still have that within a naturalistic framework. I mean, Sellers himself is wrestling with that problem for his entire career. And some people think he solves it, others are not so sure. I certainly think that one of the things that happens with the McDowell and Brandom is that they really take very seriously the normative, but then the question then arises, okay, but what happens to naturalism? That's a question that you find debated with people like Joseph Rouse and Preston Stovall and many others today. So I think it's a question here. Now, as for this point about removing contradiction, ending with materialism in the Braudioti sense, I guess, I mean, you might be right, Kirill, that if we remove contradiction, we end up with a kind of neo-Spinozism. That might be right, but I'd still want to know, okay, so what's wrong with that? Like, why would that be a problem? Now, I mean, because I have very strong, as you know, I have very strong Spinozistic sympathies. So I might be more, I mean, there might be interesting questions there about, although not all the way. I mean, there are more problems with Spinoza's own approach that have been nicely pointed out by people such as Hegel, right? But there's certainly interesting worries. Well, I mean, it's one thing to say that, well, I mean, you might end up, I mean, here I'm just sort of kind of inventing ideas as I yammer at you, but, you know, one might possibly think, well, we need to, in a sense, be emergentists about dialectics itself and think about how, as we go from the physical to the biological to the cultural, we find a kind of movement from very non-dialectical systems, such as those of physics, through quasi-dialectical systems, such as those of organism-environment transactions, to much more emphatically, explicitly dialectical systems, such as we see in the course of cultural evolution. So maybe room for all sorts of innovations here that would need to be examined, both for their conceptual adequacy as well as for how they might fit into the larger context of these debates. Okay, I think it's 11:25, so I think maybe Aaron Marcus, you can have the last word here for today.
Oh, lovely, thank you. I guess then I would just say I wanted to go back to Roy Wood for a second, because we're focusing, like, we've gotten more or less where I wanted to go on the crux here is like the problem of ethics and practical philosophy. Marxism is a thing about how we ought to engage in this project of social transformation, right? Marx was trained as an academic philosopher and decided to become a professional activist in the trade unionist movement and devoted his life to that, and railed against professional philosophy in his writings, right? Yeah, we're kind of stuck on this question of if we have scientific socialism, how are we deriving oughts and what's the status of ought claims? To kind of sum it up. And I wanted to go back to Roy Wood's introduction because it really doesn't get that much attention. It's very much toward the end, and I kind of just highlighted this one sentence. There's no sense in speaking of what ought to be apart from needs and purposes. Right. The materialist is more concerned with the perspective of increasing the good than with rigorism for its own sake. there's a lot of confusion and sort of mixed up attitudes here. It's reading this last section 3 from Roy Wood. I'm getting like
the new materialism.
Yeah, just how
Okay.
he closes it in that last section. He
Okay.
he wants to sort of derive this sort of new materialist discussion of values and ethics from psychology, but he doesn't want to give it over entirely to psychology, right? There, he says that there's an important like pro and negative attitudes of living creatures, volitional side of the self, right? He's giving some role to psychology here. He's kind of voicing some utilitarianist perspectives, but then he's also saying, in speaking of what ought to be, there's no sense apart from needs and purposes. And right there, we have two terms which don't really fit together at all in that positive psychologist, right? What's a purpose? Right. And this is where we get either to your cybernetics or to the core of the neo-Hegelian discussion about sort of reviving a sense of Aristotelian or Platonic sort of teleology and purposiveness as our conception of life, and then of a kind of dialectical or self-aware purposiveness as a sapience, right? As intelligent, self-conscious life, free life. So yeah. that's sort of where we get the sort of overarching framework that this class wants to take up.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
And I think the interesting question here is, how do we want to interrogate that? Do we think that that kind of view of purposiveness and teleology can work with Marx's historical materialism or with dialectical materialism? What's the role of psychology there? Do we want to reject psychology and psychologism as playing too much of a role in the history of Marxism? I think most of you who know me think I'm sympathetic to that. But I think those are kind of the questions we want to address going forward, right? It's like,
yeah, I mean, I suppose to add to this, right? There's this interesting, like, there's this footnote, right? There's a footnote which there he adds, right, where he says much of the ethical discussion of values follows the wild goose chase inaugurated by the so-called naturalistic fallacy of G.E. Moore, which he now acknowledges not to be a fallacy. Right. So for those of you who don't know this, G.E. Moore was a very famous early British analytic philosopher who basically argues that it's a mistake to try and define the term good or goodness in any set of descriptive predicates, right? Whether that's pleasure or happiness or well-being or whatever, right? Moore, as it argues, is always a mistake to define good in terms of any set of descriptive predicates, physical, psychological, or sociological, or what have you. But then here, right, he sort of said, but I think Sellers is very skeptical of Moore's approach. He wants to say, look, natural values are presupposed by moral questions. Appraisals are empirical and justifiable. By their very nature, values are reflexive and situational. Here, the modern materialist is humanistic and cultural. And of course, it's often not clear what exactly Roy Wood means by those adjectives. But I take it that what he has in mind is something like this. if you want to find out whether a particular, say, if you want to find out whether, say, a city should have a publicly funded literacy program in its schools, well, you can find out what outcomes that would have. You can say, look at the outcomes of policies. You can say, what are the outcomes of broken windows policing? What are the outcomes of, say, deregulating industry? And are those outcomes good? Are those desirable? Do those outcomes satisfy human needs? All right, and those are going to be empirical questions. And we can look to those sorts of things to then having justified for being able to justify or not justify the kinds of public policies that we think are reasonable. So I think that's kind of what he has in mind. And that might be a little bit too mundane. It's not very philosophical in the bad sense of philosophical. But Roy Wood doesn't care about being philosophical in the bad sense. He cares about being philosophical in the good sense. Okay, it's now 11:33. There was a question in the chat about was this about the presentations? So my understanding is that presentations are optional. Some, oh, I see, right. So there's another part of the paper for presentations. Thank you. Yeah, do you want to talk about this for a moment?
Yeah, I can talk about it. So we had a change it was, I don't know, by the end of last year in the grading system. So now usually we have 30% of the final grade for certificate students in the form of these presentations, which can be recorded. And I think I'll send an email with some details later, but basically the idea is that yeah, anyone who's interested in pursuing the certificates should record the presentation and just send to a common drive folder for everybody by, yeah, it can be by the same date that you also scheduled for the final assignment as well. So that's it, basically.
Okay,
So they should, yeah.
Okay, so I have a question. I'm going to make sure I clarify for everybody. So what is the difference then between the presentations and the final assignment or project? Like, why do we have both, and how do they work together?
Yeah, so the final assignment is usually longer, I don't know, more complex and freer, let's say. The presentations are usually basically a comment on one of the texts that that is in the bibliography, and it can be in group form as well. You can, you know, do it in pairs or trios, and it is basically a 10 minutes recorded presentation, 10 to 15 minutes, commenting something that you found particularly interesting in one of the texts. And if you want to make a group, then it is a 20 to 30 minutes presentations, and so on and so on. So it is a very simple thing, just, I don't know, to keep track on the reading list, something like that.
Okay, I understand. That helps. Okay, that sounds good. Yeah, I think Emil has a question.
So we don't have to do these weekly anymore, or by the we do have to do them weekly.
So yeah, it doesn't need to be week by week. The folder, the sheet on the presentations is organized weekly, also because of the readings. But yeah, that's also a bit of open-ended. So if Professor Sachs is not following the presentations and using them weekly, as some people choose to do, some of our professors choose to do. So we can just put the schedule to the end of the seminar as well. It's no big deal. It is optional for non-certificate participants. Yes, Stephen, that's it.
Okay, good. That makes sense.
So yeah, if we don't have any more questions, do you want to say anything, Carl, or should we end by now?
So just one question for Armand. So the list of readings is available. It's available for it's in the Google Drive for all students.
Yeah, it's in the Google Drive.
Syllabus is there. Yeah. I think I actually still need to set up the. I think the readings are up have been posted for next week, but not for the following week. I've not yet done that. I'm trying to limit myself to readings that are available in the Dialectics Problems from Sellers website, so that they're all available as web pages. Those of you who want to read them in print, I can tell you where to find them if you wish.
All right. Emil?
Will the Brandom Spirit of Truth be, or Spirit of Trust be available on the thing? I just don't have a. Unfortunately, I'm still new to the Pittsburgh school, so I just don't really have any reading materials. Might have yet. Oh, it's on LibGen. Oh, okay. Perfect.
Yeah. Also, and there might be a bit of a problem. Actually, I'm looking at the link that was just shared in the chat for the drive, and this does not. Okay, I see. Right. So if you open up the syllabus, I embedded the links in the readings. So if you open up the syllabus, the links are embedded in the readings themselves. The only exception is that one of the readings for next week, some reflections on language games, is available as a PDF, and that should be in a separate folder that says PDFs.
Yeah.
Right. Do you see it? Now, to answer the question about the spirit of trust, I am not expecting anyone to purchase this thing. It is massive and almost 1,000 pages long. What I'm going to do for that particular section is I'm going to, many parts of that book have been available in PDF online through Brandom's own website. So what I'm simply going to do for that reading is find the appropriate PDF from his website and only assign those particular pages. The McDowell, I mean, these are all things a lot of these are things that I will need to locate on LibGen or Sci-Hub. Once I've located them, I will make them available to you. Okay. Okay. So I would say there's a Discord discussion that I will be checking in on between now and next week. If anything comes up that you want to talk with me about, by all means, send me an email at either my New Center email or my gmail.com. Okay. Very good.
All right then.
Okay. Ciao.
So bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.